British Empire was functioning as a flawed, high-entropy linear extraction model. It was mathematically doomed to fail.
Wait, right out of the gate with...
It was not defeated by some sudden romantic awakening of human rights. It collapsed because it was a structural bug waiting to crash. Energy, in the form of colonial raw materials, constantly flowed outward, dissipating across the Atlantic while artificial constraints forced useless friction back into the system.
Welcome to The Debate. Today we are looking at a pretty stark question. Was the founding of America a triumph of democratic ideology and freedom?
Or was it a cold, calculated economic decoupling, a physical taking back of resources to establish a circular capitalism loop? We are analyzing this strictly through the lens of thermodynamics, resource circulation, and systems theory.
Which is, an incredibly cynical way to look at history.
I argue that the revolution was a hyper-rational public works cartel designed solely to stop resource leakage.
And I contend that reducing the birth of an entire nation to, a piece of software infrastructure completely ignores the genuine ideological operating system that actually made the new nation sustainable. I will represent the human perspective here.
To understand the inevitability of this decoupling, look at the physical reality of the colonial economy. The British system was operating on a linear extraction algorithm.
Stop right there with linear extraction algorithm. If people are listening to this and wondering how we got from George Washington to Silicon Valley data models, we need to ground this. What does that actually mean for the colonists on the ground?
It means the British core was acting like a rogue CEO who drains 90% of the company's revenue from the bank account every single night. Eventually, the regional branches cannot even afford printer paper.
Okay, but
Britain was siphoning massive caloric and material wealth. Tobacco, cotton, timber, they pulled this from the North American continent at artificially depressed rates. They then forced manufactured goods back into the colonial market at highly inflated prices. From a systems theory perspective, that is a state of high entropy.
High entropy meaning what exactly in the context of the 18th century? They didn't know about thermodynamics.
Chaos, wasted energy, a system bleeding out. The colonial energy was continuously leaking outward to sustain the British core, with no natural replenishment cycle allowed within the colonies themselves. The wealth generated by this system was not trapped within the system to fuel further expansion. It was a leaking bucket.
Right, the mercantile system was exploitative.
The founding fathers were simply auditors who diagnosed this catastrophic resource hemorrhage. Their objective was the establishment of a closed-loop system, a circular capitalist model where capital, materials, and technological innovation could circulate autonomously.
Calling them auditors mathematically erases the human soul from the story here. The taxation, the mercantile policies, yes, they were absolutely a drain on colonial resources. The frustration was palpable.
It was a mechanical failure.
But those factors alone do not inspire tens of thousands of people to risk execution for treason. They do not motivate a freezing, starving militia to stand against the greatest military machine on the planet. You need belief for that.
The colonial elite functioned as the most sophisticated collusion in public works in history. It is exactly like a group of subcontractors who grew completely intolerant of the general contractor's tyranny. The British general contractor kept changing the blueprints, squeezing the margins, demanding arbitrary fees.
So they just walked off the job?
The solution was purely logistical. The subcontractors conspired, stole all the construction materials from the site, and built their own rival building right next door.
You are mapping cold mechanics onto what was fundamentally a human breaking point. You are talking about subcontractors stealing materials. I am talking about people reading Thomas Paine's Common Sense in freezing taverns and realizing they were born with inherent rights.
The belief system was a secondary byproduct.
That shared human belief system provided the necessary psychological calories to endure the physical deprivation. Without the ideological glue, your cold physical structure of circular capitalism would have shattered under the stress of war.
The primary mechanism that held the architecture together during that extreme stress was an encrypted trust protocol. Consider the Freemasons.
Oh, here we go. The Masons.
Narratives treat them as an occult mystery or a harmless fraternity. In the context of resource circulation, the Masonic network functioned as an 18th century encrypted mailing list. It was a highly exclusive internal network for the colonial elite.
An encrypted mailing list? You are elevating a glorified professional networking group where men drank and shared trade secrets to the status of omnipotent global architects? It's just a club.
When the penalty for organizing resistance is death by hanging, the transaction costs of collusion are astronomical. The most precious resource is not ammunition, it is trust. The Masonic lodges provided proof of stake.
Proof of stake. Again, we are talking about men in powdered wigs, not blockchain architecture. How does that even translate?
Proof of stake means you have something to lose if you betray the network. They functioned as a low-friction trust network designed specifically to filter out impurities, meaning informants, loyalists, the incompetent, and to keep intellectual and financial capital circulating entirely internally among vetted operators.
That's just basic networking.
Think of it like corporate employees dealing with an unbearable boss, which was Britain. They start venting in a private Slack channel, the Masonic Lodge. Eventually, that chatter escalates into, why don't we just launch our own startup? They quit, take the company hardware, and go independent.
Your analogy fails because any exclusive community functions on trust and exclusion. A neighborhood association arguing over where to buy the cheapest hot dogs for the local festival operates on the exact same basic dynamics.
A neighborhood association is irrelevant to this scale.
The neighbors sit around, vet who is going to run which booth, and pool resources. People form social bonds. When they share a common grievance, those bonds mobilize into political action. You do not need to call a natural human community an encrypted trust protocol.
Comparing the Masonic network to a neighborhood association is mathematically offensive. A neighborhood association is a park fountain. The water, representing resources and information, splashes arbitrarily. It is completely public.
And what's wrong with public?
Passers-by look at it and say, oh look, water, it's so pretty. The mechanism is exposed, and the kinetic energy inevitably dissipates into the sewer. It is the peak of high entropy.
Okay, and a secret society is what? A closed pipe?
It is the cooling loop of a nuclear submarine. The water never leaks, it circulates under immense calculated pressure, remains entirely invisible to the outside observer, and generates massive, concentrated power. These men did not just share trade secrets, they transitioned their operational focus from managing physical stone to managing the social architecture itself. They monopolized the assembly instructions for the giant plastic model kit of society.
Assembly instructions for a plastic model? Listen to yourself.
They were originally just a group of plumbers fixing local leaks, but they figured out how to change the molecular structure of the water itself so it only flowed to those who obeyed their specific system. They bypassed the high transaction costs of public diplomacy entirely.
You cannot chew and musket with trust. You cannot clothe a militia with assembly instructions. The physical reality of the colonial experience was brutally hard, and overcoming it required a massive shared ideological motivation. People actively chose to boycott British manufactured goods out of a profound internalized sense of injustice. They were furious.
They did not just boycott, they replaced the hardware. Your romanticism collapses the moment we examine the material reality of the colonial supply chain.
My romanticism? It's recorded history.
Textbooks obsess over the cultural significance of colonial agrarianism. Take hemp. Hemp was not a cultural artifact. It was 18th century plastic.
Plastic? It is a plant. It grows in the dirt.
It is the absolute, non-negotiable, physical hardware required to build an independent logistical network. Ropes, sails, paper. Without hemp, you cannot move physical goods, you cannot outfit a navy to protect your closed loop, and you cannot print the currency necessary to lubricate internal trade.
Sure, hemp was critical infrastructure. No one is disputing that.
Mandating hemp cultivation was a cold calculation to secure physical autonomy from the British supply lines. It was a structural necessity.
But the people working those fields were driven by human emotion. The culture of resistance was incubated in those physical spaces. In the fields, in the taverns, They gathered to forge a new unified identity.
The taverns and the alcohol consumed within them are the ultimate proof of my physical model. Alcohol in the 18th century was not a vector for socializing or forging identity.
Oh, come on. Of course it was. Taverns were the primary gathering places for political discourse. It's where they talked.
Alcohol was safe liquid fuel. It was a mandatory water purification substitute engineered to artificially lower the immense physical maintenance costs of human survival.
Water purification. They drank ale because it was the cultural norm. People liked to drink with their friends.
Consuming raw water in that environment was a biological hazard that introduced catastrophic failure rates into the labor force. Dysentery, cholera, parasites. If your labor force drinks the water, your labor force dies, and your closed-loop economy collapses.
You are turning a pub into a refueling station for meat robots.
Alcohol stabilized the biological machinery of the colonies. When the founders were organizing in these taverns, they were consuming the most efficient caloric and hydrating fuel available to maintain the structural integrity of their physical bodies. Every aspect of their behavior was optimized for survival and resource retention against the high-entropy British environment.
If this entire revolution was just a calculated effort to optimize supply chains and manage water purification substitutes, why write the Declaration of Independence?
It was required documentation.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. A syndicate of elite smugglers trying to protect their supply chains does not need to promise universal rights to the entire continent. The ideological framework had to be genuine, or the masses would never have bought into the risk of war for mere mathematical adjustment.
They wrote those declarations because it was the most efficient user manual to ensure the compliance of those very masses.
An efficient user manual? You are talking about the foundation of modern democracy.
I am talking about members of a massive golf course.
A golf course? Unbelievable.
The British Empire is the golf course. The colonial members are tired of the exorbitant dues, and management never lets them play the premium holes. Their response? They clear a wild mountain next door to build their own private country club. They declare all golfers are created equal.
But they weren't.
Precisely. By design, the founding board members who bought the mountain keep the best tee times for themselves.
So you are saying the rights were a complete fiction, just marketing.
The system shifted from the roulette wheel spun by Britain to a private casino where only the colonial elite controlled the chips. The reality is exactly like corporate employees running a massive side hustle on company hardware during business hours.
A side hustle.
Headquarters is finally about to catch them, so they scream, "This is about the diversity of work styles," and they steal the entire office to start a rival firm. The ideology was a pragmatic shield against the consequences of their resource theft.
Even if I accept your premise, which I don't, that it started as a private casino, you are completely ignoring the cascade effect of the operating system they installed. They wrote all men are created equal into the foundational code. That post hoc branding, as you dismissively call it, became a self-fulfilling prophecy.
The expansion of rights was merely the system adjusting its internal parameters to prevent a catastrophic thermodynamic failure.
No, the operating system inevitably outgrew the original cartel. Those documents created a framework that eventually forced the system to expand rights to all players, not just the original property-owning elites. Look at the abolition of slavery, the women's suffrage movement, the civil rights era.
Those were pressure releases.
You cannot run a complex society on sheer exploitation and resource hoarding forever. The ideological code they wrote had the destruction of their own exclusivity embedded within it. Calling this a public works cartel minimizes the profound evolution of human rights that directly resulted from it.
The private casino did not change its fundamental nature. Management simply allowed a few more demographics to pull the lever on the slot machines so they would not burn the building to the ground.
That is...
When the marginalized factions within the nation threatened to collapse the internal architecture, the elites expanded the definition of equality just enough to relieve the pressure and maintain the core resource loop.
That is a chillingly dark reading of history. You are looking at the invention of modern democracy and calling it a side hustle going corporate. It is a fascinating diagnostic tool to view history as a cold calculation of resource loops, I'll give you that. But a nation cannot survive on algorithms alone.
It survives on nothing else.
The ideological brand of freedom
even if it was initially weaponized by a specific class for their own protection, fundamentally altered the human trajectory. It gave people a reason to maintain the physical structure when the math did not add up. The British linear extraction model may have been doomed, sure, but the American model survives because the idea of liberty was the essential glue. That ideology kept the structural integrity intact through wars, depressions, and internal strife. Without the human belief in the system, the architecture collapses.
A belief system does not generate structural integrity. Efficient resource allocation does. The transition from the British system to the American system was not a leap toward universal justice. It was a transition from a king's exploitation to an elite's management. The collapse of the British linear extraction system was a mathematical certainty. It was a high-entropy bug that could not be patched. The pivot to a circular capitalist model, managed by an encrypted trust network, was never about human rights. It was the only rational, calculated investment for survival in a highly volatile physical world. The resources were recaptured. The loop was closed. The thermodynamic bug in the extraction model was successfully patched by those who controlled the new machine.